So, welcome, Kimberly. Thank you so much for talking to me today. I'm really excited to talk to you. How are you?
I'm really good, thank you. Yeah, really back at work. This is the first full week back at work, and actually, it's really good to be back. I always miss it when I've been away, so it's really cool.
That's always a good sign, isn't it? When you miss your job and you're looking forward to getting back to it.
Definitely
I,
is. Yeah.
I just wasn't ready for 2019 to start this year. I decided that it started on Monday, the 7th. I was not ready on January the 1st whatsoever. So I
No,
feel like it's
I
just
think
starting now.
I saw someone this morning, and they'd been to the gym on January 1st, and I just thought there's no need for
It's a
that,
bit
really.
too keen.
Take the day off, relax, stop in a second.
Yeah, yeah, amazing. So, can you tell us, for people that don't know, what it is that you do and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, so I mean, it's always a difficult conversation because I feel like I have lots of hyphenation in my work, but the kind of foundation part is that I am a chartered counselling psychologist, so I'm qualified to work in individual psychotherapy with adults, and that's the kind of main thing that I do. And I started my career working in prisons, so I have experience working with offending and aggression and personality disorders. And then on top of that, so once I left the prison, on top of that, I've done a separate postgraduate training in nutrition where I focused on nutrition for neurodegenerative diseases. And one of my big kind of soapboxes, I guess, is helping people to understand that there is the biological side of mental health and mental illness, and that lifestyle factors such as nutrition and sleep and exercise have a really profound effect on their mental health, and they are really important things to consider, not just kind of little mental things that might be helpful. There's really good, robust science, and I really want to get that information out to people.
That's fascinating to me. Why do you think it is that people don't recognize that link or dismiss that and think, oh, it's fine for me to go to bed really late every night? And I don't know, what do you think is the disconnect
There's,
there?
I think there are a few things. I think one of the big ones, and I always, I often run some seminars about this, and I always start with an apology on behalf of psychology, because I think psychology and psychiatry played a big role in the separation of the brain and the body. And we kind of looked at it kind of historically as if the only thing that mattered was the brain. It was like there was just a brain in the jar, and the body was just this kind of meat suit that carries you around. And so there wasn't any real, I think, respect or appreciation for the fact that what happens in the body affects the brain. And it's odd because obviously the brain is an organ, like your liver, like your heart, like the rest of your body. And so it depends on nutrition from your diet and the quality of the biochemistry in your body, which is related to hormones and exercise. It definitely depends on the quality of your sleep for a lot of its normal processes. So of course they're completely connected, but we've got so kind of obsessed with the idea of the brain as a separate entity that we kind of lost connection to the body and its really crucial role to brain health.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we think of it as mind and body as these two separate entities, as if they're not completely connected.
Yeah.
But of course, yeah, when you take care of your body, your mind's gonna benefit from that.
Yeah,
Um,
it's
can
one
you?
system.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, can you tell us about what is the kind of what is the link between the mind and the body, for example, in a practical way? How does that? How does that? How do you see people? I don't know. I don't want to say making mistakes, but what are the things that we do to our bodies that have that negative impact on our minds or our mental health?
Well, I think one of the biggest problems is that we're not really thinking about our brains at all. And one of the reasons for that is simply because you can't see it, right? So your brain is locked away in your skull. And so if you go on a diet or if you do a detox, if you do a cleanse, whatever, you start a big workout regime, you can see the results. Like you can physically see the impact of all of the changes that you're making within a few weeks, not immediately, but within a few weeks. And you kind of get that feedback that what I'm doing is making a difference and it has an impact and people will congratulate me for it, and all that validation that comes from the physical changes. And so with the brain, I think one of the things that there's just much less incentive. The changes can be kind of incremental, and they take time. No one else knows about it. You're not really sure if you can trust it, and also it's not as easily measurable as, say, checking your cholesterol levels or measuring your waist circumference. So it's a much more long-term thing, and humans aren't great at kind of looking into the future and investing in the future. We want results right now, and it's not obvious, and we don't get so which will ignoring our brains until something goes wrong. So until we start feeling depressed, until we're getting anxiety, or much later, which is one of the things I really want people to start really appreciating, is until we start getting memory problems in our 50s and 60s and so on. And dementia and Alzheimer's disease and all the dementias are really on the rise, and they're the leading cause of death in the UK now. So this is a massive problem that we really need to start taking seriously.
And I'm sure this isn't a simple maybe answer, but what leads to things like dementia? Is there clear evidence on what causes that?
Yeah, so there is really. So if we think about Alzheimer's disease, most of I kind of focus on Alzheimer's disease in most of my degrees. And so with Alzheimer's disease, there is a genetic component. So people have a gene called the APOE4 gene, which is a mutation of the APOE gene, and that can raise your risk. If you have 2 copies of that raises your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, or early onset Alzheimer's disease, which is kind of in your 40s and 50s. But we think that only really accounts for about 2 to 5% of our global cases of Alzheimer's disease. So much of the rest of it is what's called sporadic, which is you just get it. We don't know what's happened. It's just arisen. And then there's a huge group which is associated with lifestyle. And so those lifestyle factors, we call them the midlife lifestyle factors. There's a big World Health Organization study on it, which said that if people took the kind of best case scenario, so if you maintained a healthy weight, if you kept your blood pressure down, if you kept your cholesterol within healthy levels, if you made sure you ate plenty of vegetables and fiber, if you take regular exercise, stay engaged, take care of your hearing, all of that stuff, best case scenario. But we could prevent about a third of global cases of Alzheimer's disease. So that's about 15 million cases out of about 43 million cases. So there's a huge way in which is the health of our brains and our ability to kind of take care of ourselves as older adults and to live fulfilling lives in our older years is really related to taking care of ourselves earlier on. And I think the thing with things like dementia and Alzheimer's disease is that the brain changes are visible in the brain often 2 decades before symptoms arrive. So if you're getting symptoms in your 60s, if you're starting to forget where you put things, forgetting people's names, actually the damage is already visible in your 40s. And so one of my big goals is to really try to get people to take that message on board and start putting in little habits now that will really help them protect their brain health into the future.
That is so fascinating. Gosh, I think we're so often all about those quick fixes, and I saw something on Instagram today. I've eaten a piece of kale and now we wait. This kind of this kind of idea that if I meditated once and it didn't cure my depression, so therefore I'm not going to do it. I tried eating well for a week and it didn't sort my anxiety out, therefore I'm not going to do it. But actually it is so much about the long term and the long game. And
and I think if people understood the processes, so with the meditation, for example, I think that is what happens. You try it and you do it for maybe a fortnight and I don't feel any less anxious. I don't feel like I've got any more focus. I'm not getting the results that everybody's kind of talking about. But the big study on meditation was an 8 week, the Harvard study was 8 weeks of consistent meditation, 40 minutes a day. I think it was 40 minutes. I could check that. So actually you're having to invest 2 months out of the bat in order to get the changes. But actually what you did get was physical changes in the brain. There were different structures in the brain, more connections. So stuff is happening, but we're talking about tiny kind of microscopic changes over time, and you have to stay fairly consistent in order to be able to get the results. And I think that's the thing. It's the consistency and the effort, and I think people need to know that it is paying off. You might not be able to see it straight away, but it's definitely paying off, and you just need to kind of stick with it for a little bit longer.
Okay, so consistency is really key.
Massive.
That's good information. I liked some of the statistics you gave us just then. I like that sort of thing. Is there anything around that and diet and mental health? So things like anxiety and depression. How much of an impact can it have, or what? Have you got any like nice motivating sound bites for us?
So one of the big things about nutrition research is often how difficult it can be to do. So often you have to get people to tell you what they've eaten, and you do that typically with food frequency questionnaires, and you ask people, how often in the last 6 months did you eat this, and all of that stuff. And they can be quite inaccurate because people either, you forget what you've eaten, like I'm not sure I could say with 100% accuracy what I ate yesterday, so you forget what you've eaten, or you want to appear a bit healthier to the researcher, so maybe you kind of talk down how much alcohol you've been drinking and all of that sort of stuff. So it can be really tricky, but one of the places to start is with epidemiology, which is looking at big groups of people and looking at overall trends. And so that's been happening for a really long time, and there was lots of observational and epidemiological research saying it looks like people who eat healthier diets get less depression. And so there was a big SUN trial. It was called the SUN trial in Spain, and it was 15,000 people followed over 10 years. And they split you into 5 groups, the results into 5 groups. So the people in groups 5 had the healthiest diets, and the people in group 1 had the least healthy diets. And they found that the people in groups 2 to 5, so you didn't even need to have a perfect diet, but people in the groups 2 to 5 had around a 30% reduced risk of depression 10 years later than the people in group 1. And so there are lots of trials like that. Lots of the Whitehall study is a big study of civil servants in the UK, and it found that women who had healthier diets were much less likely to have recurrent depression. But the thing with observational studies is just how you can never be absolutely certain about the causality. Maybe being depressed makes you eat badly. We don't really know. But the big kind of landmark study for this is the SMILES trial, which was published in 2017 out of Australia. And it was an RCT, so you have your control group who don't have the intervention, and you have the active arm of the group. And so they had about 36 people who were clinically depressed, who were in treatment, and half the group were given a Mediterranean-style diet plan and meetings with a nutritionist to how to improve their diets. And the other half were given befriending, which has been shown to improve mood. And at the end of 12 weeks, a third of the group, and it's a small trial, so it was 12 people, but a third of the group in the active arm were in remission from depression. And that's since been replicated by other groups. And so we think we're starting to be able to show a causal relationship between nutrition and the quality of your diet and your risk of depression. And so we're really at the beginning of that, but the fact that we've already got our first replication, and that I think there's another one coming out, another meta-analysis, we can start to say with much more surely, like with much more certainty, that there is a causal relationship between the quality of your diet and your risk of things like depression, anxiety, and dementia. And I just realised how long I've spoken for.
No, that's so fascinating to me. I love that. I could listen to things like that all day. I'm a massive science geek, so I love it, and I hope people appreciate listening to this as well, because I think knowing that there is good evidence behind something is motivating to help you to make those changes. And actually, if I was depressed, I think, to know that changing my diet could help, that would be the thing that could probably cause you to stick to eating all that olive oil and vegetables. And
Yeah,
yeah,
because some people say that, oh, blah blah blah, the research, but I think people are kind of just sick of just being told what to do without knowing why they should do it. And I think it can be helpful to say, well, yes, I think you should eat vegetables, but here is why. Like, we can literally see the changes in your brain. And I think it is more motivating for people.
yeah, yeah. And just to for people that don't know what a Mediterranean diet is, can you briefly explain that?
Yeah, so it's a very, and I guess the difference, I guess the point is, often diet, a peasant Mediterranean diet. So it's lots of beans, lots of whole grains, olive oil, seafood, small amounts of meat. Because if you're thinking about a kind of peasant diet, we're talking about, not having lots of money to spend on expensive ingredients. So that's why beans are such a huge feature. Lots of vegetables, leafy greens, berries, and small amounts of red wine, and nuts, nuts basically every day, about 5-10 times a week, something like that.
Okay. So quite simple, not something that's going to be super expensive.
No, yeah,
Hopefully
and
quite easy for people to do.
yeah, and it doesn't have to be, Mediterranean. I think a lot of the research is starting to say it's just the quality of your diet. If you're eating more whole foods and fewer free sugars and less saturated fat, then that's really going to make the difference. It seems to be, and plenty of fiber, but it's more about whole foods and the quality of your diet. And it doesn't have to be restrictive. They're not saying never have a cookie ever again in your life, but that the majority of your diet should be these kind of fiber rich, polyphenol rich foods.
I think that's such an important point about not thinking that just because you eat sugar one day that you're gonna increase your chances of, I don't know, depression or something, but seeing your diet as a whole, and don't beat yourself up about something, but just the quality overall of it is really important. Why is serotonin so important? Can you tell us about that?
Yes.
Big topic.
It's massive. So serotonin, it plays lots of roles in the body. Like, people will know it as the happy hormone. It's the hormone that's kind of associated with improvements in mood. But that's not the only thing it does in the brain, and it's not the only thing that it does in the body. So in the brain, it also helps with learning and memory consolidation. So taking the stuff that you've kind of seen in the day and encoding it into your brain, serotonin is associated with that. It also has a role in sleep. So all of that sort of stuff it does in the brain, but it also has quite a big role to play in the rest of the body. So one of the fun stats is that 90% of the serotonin in your body is found in and around the gut. So 10%, around 10% in the brain, and 90% in the gut. And most of what it does in the gut is to support motility, which is the movement of food through the gut. And it's not that this serotonin can affect that serotonin, it doesn't kind of cross over, but it might communicate to the brain through the vagus nerve, which is part of the gut-brain axis. So it might be sending messages. In fact, it probably almost certainly is sending messages to the brain about what's happening in the gut. So there's this really strong connection, and it's really interesting how something that's known as a brain hormone actually has these total body effects.
Wow. Okay, so the serotonin in the gut is sending messages up to the brain. They're communicating with each other, basically.
Possibly, yeah. So it has its role in motility, but the thing about the vagus nerve, so it's this long nerve that goes from kind of the back of your skull all the way down, and it connects into basically all your organs, the heart and the liver and the kidneys and blah, 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 and finishes in the gut. And it's this bi-directional highway, so traffic is moving in both directions. But if you imagine it as a motorway, then actually 8 of the lanes are going from the gut to the brain, and only 2 are coming down. So it tells us that there's probably quite an important, it's a really important mechanism for communication from the gut to the brain.
Okay, and does that link into gut health then, and taking care of our guts? would you say? What's the
Yeah, like
link there?
massively. So one of the reasons I decided to really cross over these two things, because I could just kind of quite happily sit down and just do straight psychology. Um, but I was seeing more and more people with IBS, and it's kind of my favorite disorder, but because IBS, it's called a functional disorder. But the thing about, and it means irritable bowel syndrome, and it's a collection of symptoms like pain and discomfort and bloating and changing in stools. But one of the big features of it is that it's really highly what we call comorbid with depression. So up to 80% of people who have IBS present with depression. And quite often, if you get a stomach bug, quite often a little bit later down the line, you might be diagnosed with depression or have a depressive episode. So there's this kind of a long history of seeing these very similar things. And what we know about IBS is that it is a stress sensitive disorder. So stress, psychological stress, is one of the diagnostic criteria. So it's this real kind of clear as day link between something's going up in the brain and it's expressing itself as depression, and something's going on in the gut, which is expressing itself as all of these uncomfortable and sometimes embarrassing symptoms of IBS. And the thing about people who have IBS is that they kind of get pushed from pillar to post. So they end up, going to a nutritionist or a dietitian, and the dietitian will, try a few things, and maybe you try FODMAPs or you try something else, and it still doesn't give you all the results you want. Or they go and see a psychologist, and the psychologist works on the stress, but there's still maybe some nutritional stuff that needs to be sorted out. And I think it's really difficult to have that experience of having to keep repeating your story. And so I started to really think about how important it is to assess these things together and see the whole thing as a unified disorder.
That's so fascinating, the link between depression and IBS. So if someone came to you with depression, what would you say to them? What do you advise first of all?
So my big thing is I'm a massive advocate for a thorough assessment, and I do a very thorough assessment. So my assessment takes at least 2 sessions, 2-hour-long sessions, sometimes more, depending on the complexity of the issue. But I also start out with a quite extensive questionnaire. And in that questionnaire, I want to know your medical history. So I want to know how many sets of antibiotics you had as a kid. Did you have any pets? Were there any illnesses? Were any hospitalizations? I'll ask about things like anxiety and depression. I'll ask about your relationship with food. I like to have a sense of what someone's kind of eating style is, because that can give a hint about potential nutritional deficiencies. So all of the kind of physical stuff. And then when we meet, I will do the kind of standard psychological assessment. So I want to know, do you enjoy your work? What your relationships are like? Was school fun for you? What was growing up like for you? What are your fears? How do you view the world? All of that. And then I put that together. And then I present my clients with a formulation. So I will kind of sit down and say, here is your issue as I see it. Here are what the physiological possibilities might be that are affecting you. Here are the psychological components that I think are playing into this. So maybe you ruminate, or maybe there are ways in which you self-sabotage, and that kind of plays into the system as well. And here are the potential ways that I would want to work with you with it. And at that point, the person says, okay, either great, let's get started, or maybe I'll think about it, or I'm not ready, or whatever. But it's at that point where we have a negotiation about how we go forward. Because the other thing about therapy is that it really needs to be the person needs to be ready, is the first thing. Yeah. But also it needs to be a good match. Like they need to feel safe, they need to feel comfortable. And I think people really need to take time to make sure that they have that, and to not feel under pressure to go with the first therapist that they meet or something like that.
Yeah. That's interesting that you say that, because when you look at studies into different types of therapy, often the the most important factor is how well you get on with your therapist and that relationship. So for people who are thinking about finding a therapist, go meet a few people first, or have some conversations. And as you said, you don't need to go with the first person that you meet or talk to. That's so true. Okay, so going back to the depression, I saw that you wrote a really interesting blog post about inflammation. And I've written about this before and kind of looked into this, and it's something that often people have no idea about, or even what inflammation is or why it would have an impact. But why might inflammation have an impact on our mental state?
So we think that inflammation might be the underlying mechanism behind all of these things, or at least one of them. And inflammation, is it's the immune system response to illness or injury. So I like to think of it as your innate immune system is like policemen who are just walking around the streets, just making sure everything's okay and everything's fine. And they're ready if they see something. And so if a virus, or you scratch yourself, or you've caught a bug, that's the crime scene, and they see that, then they can call in recruits, deal with the issue, and then once the issue's dealt with, the backup goes back to the station, and it just, everything goes back down to this kind of observational level. And that's perfect. That's what we want. We want a nice, healthy response that ramps up when there's something wrong, and then dials back down when there's no pathogen to fight. But there are certain things that people do in their daily lives, certain lifestyle habits that can make it seem, it's almost like you've got a high terror alert. And so there are extra policemen walking around, very anxious, not sure what they're doing. And when that happens, you're kind of in this state of what's called chronic inflammation, and the immune system can start interfering with healthy tissues and healthy processes in the body, and that includes in the brain. So kind of neuroinflammation is one of the kind of most prominent theories of some of the subgroups of depression at the moment. And it seems to explain a lot of the relationships between kind of lifestyle factors or life experiences and depression. So things like childhood adversity, child abuse. We know that children who have been abused have higher inflammation, and they are also much more likely to become depressed. Poor diet increases your chronic inflammation and is a risk factor for depression. Experiences of racism increase your levels of inflammation, the markers of inflammation in your blood, and increase your risk of depression. So we think inflammation is this kind of unifying mechanism behind depressive experiences. And that's why for some people, having an anti-inflammatory or a non-pro-inflammatory diet might help. It's not going to solve all the problems, but it might help to kind of dial it down a little bit for some people.
Okay, so stress could cause the inflammation, whether that's, so if someone they've experienced child abuse, would that inflammation last until adulthood, or is that just looking at children then?
No, we think it lasts.
Yeah.
And it almost kind of changes the threshold for stress. So it's almost as if when you've had an experience of adversity in childhood, and often a kind of adversity that overwhelms the child's capacity to manage it, it's almost as if the threshold for that distress drops a little bit. And so it takes much less to push that child or physiologically into a state of inflammation or stress or distress. And that seems, they call it a biological scar. It seems to be present there all of the time, actually, and definitely into late adolescence and into mid-adulthood.
Wow, okay. And when you talk about a poor diet creating that inflammation, are there certain foods that do that, or is it not that simple? Is it kind of like, yes, sugar is the enemy and we should be
Right. So,
avoiding it?
like I'm a big fan of cake, so I'm not the person to tell you
Yeah,
never to eat sugar.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And again, so in the SMILES trial, for example, people were allowed to eat what they called extra foods, so sweet foods, fry foods, fun foods, 3 times a week. So basically every other day. And they still saw these kind of positive results. So that's what I mean when I say you don't have to completely eliminate these foods from your diet.
Okay, good news, good news.
Yeah, and there was a thing last year about the anti-anxiety diet, which I kind of commented on in an article, and it's not that. We're talking about your overall dietary pattern, not the odd food.
Yeah.
So you can certainly enjoy all of those sweet things as long as you're getting, sufficient fiber, sufficient vegetables, sufficient sleep, omega-3s. Like your body will be able to manage it, but it's talking about the kind of overall balance.
Yeah, yeah, that's very reassuring and sensible sounding, and we don't want to be cutting lots of things out if we don't have to. So you mentioned omega-3. Would you say someone should take a supplement, or is that just about eating oily fish, or what would you suggest?
So, I personally, I take a supplement, but I think also I spend a lot of time reading all of these articles, and maybe I've kind of scared myself into supplementation. Most of the evidence suggests that if you take about a gram of omega-3s daily, that's associated with the most protection from things like Alzheimer's disease. And I guess that's probably the thing that scares me most. I think relying so much as I do on my brain and thinking so much about brains and mental health and it being my work, I guess it's the thing that really concerns me.
Yeah.
I also try to eat a lot of oily fish, so a couple of times a week. So I don't know. I think if people feel like they're getting, their 2 servings a week of oily fish, so the NHS says 2 servings of fish a week, 1 of which should be oily. I would say probably try to aim for 2 servings of oily fish. Then maybe not. But as a kind of precaution, I don't think there's any real harm as long as you're not taking ridiculous doses, as long as you're not on kind of blood thinning medication. There shouldn't really be any real risk.
Yeah, okay. And for people that don't eat fish, can they have other vegan sources or vegetarian sources, or is it not quite the same?
It's not quite the same. So the thing with omega-3s is that they come in 3 forms. So there's ALA, DHA, and EPA. And so DHA and EPA are the ones that we think are most beneficial for the brain, and they form the structure of the cell membrane. So it's literally the outside of the cell is made up of these fats. And they're found in fish and fish roe, so caviar and roe products. The ALA is found in things like walnuts and flax seeds, but your body then needs to convert it, and it's just not very efficient at converting it. So it converts somewhere between 8 and 11%, and women can do it a bit better than men. So it's just not that reliable a source. So for vegans, I would probably recommend an algae-based supplement. So the algae kind of synthesize that's where the fish get it. They get it from the fish eat the algae, and they concentrate all the omega-3 in their bodies, and then we eat the fish. So if you're going straight to the algae source, then you kind of cut out the middleman and take an algae-based supplement.
Okay, that's good. That's good news, because I'm a vegetarian as well. I'm a bit inconsistent with my omega-3s, but I am inspired now to maybe get some more algae omegas in my life. So that's good. One more thing diet related I wanted to ask you, because obviously it's winter here in the UK, and in the winter we don't get a lot of sunlight, and there's a lot, we hear things in the media and things about how important vitamin D is. Does vitamin D play a role in our mental health? Is it important for that, would you say?
We think so. So Vitamin D is a tricky one just because sometimes the research can be a bit inconsistent, and sometimes that's just about how the research has been done. So whether you've checked someone's levels at baseline before you've given them the supplement, or whether people have come in with decent levels anyway, so supplementation isn't going to make any difference. So possibly, and we think if there is a role, then it's possibly in depression and possibly in Alzheimer's disease, as well as the other stuff that it does in terms of immune function. So one of the things it does do is to help regulate immune function. So perhaps there, if it's helping to deal with inflammation, that could be one of the ways that it works. But that said, the NHS recommends a vitamin D supplement to all adults during the winter. And particularly if you have dark skin, we're not making it from the sunshine, certainly not making it from the sunshine in the UK. Yeah. So I need to take a vitamin D supplement as well.
Yeah, okay, good. I've been taking a vitamin D spray, and over Christmas, everyone around me was getting colds and flu, and I was just there with my vitamin D spray trying to take loads, hoping that it would somehow protect me. And I haven't had a cold yet, but can slightly feel one brewing actually, but hopefully I'll be all right. But I don't know if the vitamin D made any difference, but it's worth doing. And if the NHS says it's good advice and you say it's good advice, then I think it's worth a try.
Mm.
Yeah. I was
some interesting.
Sorry, go on.
Oh no, it's a little kind of it's like one of the interesting things that I'm looking forward to hearing about vitamin D is its role in Alzheimer's disease, because it's possible that one of the things it might do is to help clear out some of the kind of tangled proteins that are one of the features of Alzheimer's disease. So I'll be keeping an eye out for that sort of research as well.
Okay. So we need vitamin D and maybe just more holidays in the sun.
Much more sunshine, much less stress.
I was just curious, just on a personal level, maybe on professional level, what's the best piece of advice that you've ever been given? Oh God, I feel like people don't really give me advice.
Let me think. I don't know. I feel like one of the things that's increasingly important is, and one of the pieces of advice I don't think I've necessarily been given, but I really like, is to don't believe everything you think. And I think that's because one of the things about psychology is that we have our own blind spots, and we can be very well informed about a whole bunch of stuff and then just not really have that much insight into ourselves. And to think that we're unbiased, and to think that we're thinking rationally, and thinking that we're, responding to the events as they're happening, but actually we don't know what kind of unconscious mechanisms are at play in our own minds. So, but I think because it's so subjective, people often, and certainly one of the things that happens in therapy, is that people get convinced by their own beliefs. So if they say, I'm worthless, or I'm useless, or I'm not good at anything, because it's a thought that's come out of their own minds, they believe it. And so, and then the job is to be like, okay, well, let's have a look at the evidence, or what's happening there. Let's see if we can confront this idea, because I think just because it's a belief that's come out of your own head doesn't make it a fact. And I think a lot of the stuff that's happening at the moment in terms of, like political arguments and, all of the aggression and hostility you see between the right and the left, is because people are so entrenched in their own beliefs that they're unwilling to see that there might be some flaws in their own reasoning. So I think don't believe everything you think, and to hold your ideas lightly. Like, be willing to be wrong, be willing to make a mistake and have that pointed out to you without getting too defensive, and that'll just help all of us.
Yeah. That's such a good one, isn't it? That's so key, because I think particularly in depression and anxiety, the thoughts that we have can just be so scary, and they come with a big emotional weight, and all our history on top of that, and it can, if we believe that, we can get quite dark and down, and just to question that. and know that we're not always right as well. I always have this, my partner is a coach, so we sometimes get into these discussions where we have to coach each other out of our point of view in our relationship, and have these kind of weird coaching relationship conversations where we both have to basically admit that we're not always right. So just from my perspective, that's a good thing for me to remember as well. Definitely. I'm also curious, is there anything that you yourself are struggling with at the moment, and what are you doing to sort of overcome that or manage that?
I think my biggest personal struggle is probably with discipline. So I get very excited about things, and when I get very excited about things, I kind of want to launch into them and do them straight away and right now. And sometimes that's really good, because that's how you get projects started, and that's how you I think that's where I have some of my best ideas, is that I just get a bit overexcited about this thing and I end up going down a rabbit hole, and I found all these links and these ideas. But it can mean that I'm not paying enough attention to details, I think. And partly that's a personality thing. So there's a scale of conscientiousness, and some people are incredibly conscientious. They kind of dot the T's, dot the I's, cross the T's people. Which probably says everything. And at the other end of conscientiousness are people who are much more about big ideas. And I think I kind of lean more towards that, but I think I need to try to get myself back towards being slightly more focused on the details.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it, just to notice ourselves and notice how a certain aspect of us can be a real gift in some areas, and to really kind of acknowledge that, but also to recognise where it holds us back and how we can change that. It's just interesting. Yeah. We all struggle with something, don't we? No one is perfect. No one is just sailing through life with no issues. Maybe some people are. Maybe the Dalai Lama or something. I imagine he doesn't have any
lovely time
issues.
Yeah, but I mean that's true, because that's often that happens in relationships too. Like, the thing that you love most about your partner is often also related to the thing that drives you crazy about them. Like, oh, I love that they're so laid back about things, but oh my God, they never do the dishes. Like, there's this kind of, it all sits in the same spectrum. And so that's such a common thing. Like, I love that they stand up for themselves, but my God, they can be so argumentative. Is this way in which the same dynamic, depending on the context and how intense it is, can be good or problematic.
So true. Thank you for that insight. So just for people that want to learn more about you and what you're up to and how they can work with you, can you tell us how people can find you?
Yep. So my clinic, if people wanted to work with me that way, is moneymentalhealth.co.uk. So you can contact me. There's a contact page there if you're thinking about looking for therapy. In terms of the kind of lifestyle, whole body mental health stuff, I think my website, my kind of non-clinical website is kimberlywilson.co, but pretty much everything happens on Instagram. So where I'm at Food and Psych, so it's FOODANDPSYCH. So that's pretty much where most of the stuff happens.
Amazing. And are you working on any particular projects at the moment, or?
I'm waiting for something might go out today. So I want to do a lot more live events. So I'm working on one regular live event, which hopefully I'll be able to announce today or tomorrow. In fact, by the time this comes out, hopefully I'll be able to announce it. So I'm doing a regular book club called Thinking Space. So we're going to look at the psychological themes of a whole different bunch of books over wine, have chats, maybe the odd occasional special guest. It's going to be in Mortimer House, which is a lovely private members club in London. So that should be, I'm really looking forward to that. I'm very excited about that. And then I'm working on another project. Hopefully I'll get out for June. And other than that, it's mostly the podcast and kind of sharing info there.
Brilliant, brilliant. And I'll post all the links to that in the notes below this episode so everyone can find you and hear all that. There's exciting things going on. Thank you so much for talking to me. I am just blown away by all the information, and it's really, really helpful. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.